In this STOic TTX Facilitator training video, we wanted to go over some examples of tabletop exercise scenarios. Some of you might not have been through one, might not have seen one. You might not know what this entire process might look like or how to do it in the STOic TTX style. So we wanted to go through some examples of this. Now we have a bit of a challenge in that I am alone and I don't have people to do with, and I didn't want to have sort of a back and forth with an individual in some kind of a scripted form. So this is going to be a tabletop scenario with me playing all the parts. And I will try my best not to make this cheesy, but I wanted to show you some of this process and how to handle this and how the flow might go. And this is fairly typical from my experiences in how things are going to work. We're not going to get into extreme cases or some of the corner cases, just a really basic, really simple couple of scenarios. The first one I want to go through is not a cybersecurity tabletop scenario at all. So to get you an idea to how things work without needing to know anything about cybersecurity, we're going to talk about something really generic, something common to everybody, and it's going to be really, really short. It's a sunny afternoon, you're walking down the street, and you feel that your laces are untied on one of your shoes. What do you do? Oh, I bend down and tie my shoe. Okay, so you bend down, you tie your laces. As you do, you feel a rip. What do you do? Ooh, that's a problem. Well, I guess, is there a store nearby where I can buy a new pair of trousers? What do I need to do here? Am I wearing a jacket or a jumper? Can I tie something around my waist to cover the rip? What can I do? Now notice in that inject that I provided, I didn't say what ripped. Everyone naturally assumes sort of the worst case scenario, and most people don't challenge that. And that works in a facilitator's favor because they immediately go to the high risk scenario. So you get to chase some of these things. Sometimes you will have people who are like, okay, but what ripped? We need to know some details here. That's fine. So you can push into that or not. Okay, so now as you are tying your shoes and you're getting that last tug in, the laces snap. What do you do? Or how does that change your situation? A snapped lace. Well, I would undo some of the lace from the shoe and tie the broken parts together so that I can tie the laces together and fix them when I get home or go to a store and get some replacement laces. So here we have a really simple scenario with a couple of injects, and mostly the discussion is on the participant side, and you can dig into their responses as you wish. And a tabletop scenario can be just that simple and that straightforward. The participants will feel very, very engaged the more you are getting them to talk about their own responses and their own situation. If you wanted to prepare for this situation in the future, what would you want to do, or what would you want to have available or in place in order for you to be prepared? Oh, okay. I would keep a spare set of laces either in a pocket or in my jacket to make sure I can replace the laces as necessary. And for that rip, I think I would make it, if it's a problem that's going to come up very often, I would definitely want to make sure I'm always carrying a jumper or a jacket so I can tie it around my waist. I want you to see what I did as a facilitator in this imagined tabletop exercise. I started off with a bit of an imaginative scenario that was a little sensory. I said you were walking down the street and it was a sunny day. So people can start imagining the warmth of the sun, and I like adding in some of these details because it helps to trigger that imagination. The other thing it does is it gives me as a facilitator details that I can change or play with later on. I said it was a sunny day. Well, now later on, I can change the scenario to say, it's raining, or it starts to rain. But I've brought up this notion of the weather already right away. And so it's something that I can play with. It's a detail. It's a detail that makes the situation a little bit more real, and it's a detail that gives me a resource to play with later on if I need it. It's a sneaky way of setting up an inject later on. The squatting down and feeling a rip is a really sneaky inject in there as well. It's really generic and undefined, and the participants will help define it for you. I never say what rips. I let their imagination fill that in. And in some cases, for instance, if a person's wearing a skirt, there's nothing going to be ripping when you squat normally. So if something has ripped, it's not a problem. It's a problem you have to deal with later on. And it allows you as a facilitator to not have to know any of these details. The participants help fill that in themselves based on their own realities. And that's one of the ways of phrasing an inject. You don't need to be really specific. You can keep it high level. You can keep it imaginary so that the participants have to fill in the details themselves. This can take a little bit of practice to figure out how to do really well, but these injects that are not defined can help you as a facilitator use a broad range of injects that end up being hyper-specific depending upon how the participants respond. So that's a really simple, generic, non-cybersecurity type of a tabletop scenario. Next, we're going to go into something that we did in the pilot for STOic TTX and what that scenario looked like in a very generic way. In this scenario, we're going to go through ransomware. Ransomware is a really easy thing to create a scenario for because a ransomware incident is really undefined. It can be really, really simple. It can be a single infection and that's it. Or it can be part of a massive attack with multiple different facets and different things happening. The entire incident can take months. It can take minutes. And so as a facilitator, it's a great thing to use as an example. It's a great thing to run as an exercise for an organization because so many different things could happen. But in this case, what I did for the pilots in order to make things easier for myself and to make things consistent for the organizations I did the pilots with was I actually borrowed a narrative of a real attack that happened to a real organization. I knew the timeline. I knew what happened. Now, what I did was I took the scenario and I presented the initial impact being at the beginning. In the big narrative that actually happened, the initial impact happened near the end of the attack. And as a reality at this point in 2021, when ransomware becomes evident, when it becomes obvious that you're dealing with ransomware, you've actually had dozens of things go wrong and a dozen problems happen first before that happens. But in this particular case, in order to make it simple, I started off very, very simply because I could then end the scenario at any point and it would still make sense. So I start off with, it's a drizzly Friday afternoon and your CFO contacts you and says that there's a red box mentioning something about encryption in Bitcoin. What do you do? Now in that setup, I've done several things that you might be able to identify now. One, it's a drizzly Friday afternoon. I like putting in weather because it makes the situation more real. I often throw in the pilot, I threw in a little joke that it was drizzly because it's Scotland and Scotland's drizzly. Most of the days that I did the tabletop exercises, it was drizzly anyway. So it connected to reality, it connected to weather. I also said it was a Friday afternoon. And you can guess what I'm going to do with that detail later on. It sets up a time-based inject later on. Sometimes I used it, sometimes I didn't. Sometimes we didn't have time to it. We had other things to deal with, but it allowed that inject to occur. Some of the participants would keep that in mind and they would bring it up to say, but wait a minute, it's a Friday afternoon. Are we going to have all these resources because people are going to go home? And you would have people start asking, how late in the afternoon? At that point, you get to make it up. You get to decide for yourself what you want to do, and it doesn't really matter, and that's okay. So I've set all this up. It's a drizzly Friday afternoon. The CFO contacts you. Now, the CFO is a high-value, high-impact, high-risk user because if their accounts are compromised, now you're compromising a lot of other things. The consequences to it being the CFO are very large. And as a facilitator, I could choose, depending upon the responses, whether or not I chase that down. To say, wait, this is the CFO, now your bank accounts are being affected. That's the next inject. or an inject I'll bring up later on. Or I can just treat it like I never mentioned that it was the CFO and treat it like it was an average user and not worry about these other issues. I might bring up and later on to say, this was the CFO. Is the fact that it's a CFO, does that change the scenario for you? That's one of the questions I like to ask as well. Does that change the scenario for you? For whatever detail or inject I bring in. So I've brought all this up. Now, the next thing I've done is I've said that they contact you. I don't say how. The participants fill that in, have always filled that in for me, that they've put in a ticket or they've called personally, right? And they deal with that fact on their own. They filled in that with their own imagination, and that's fine. I work with that. And that there is a red box with something about encryption and Bitcoin. I never say the word ransomware. Never at any point do I mention ransomware. For the incident responders in the participant groups who know what that thing might mean, they'll immediately jump to ransomware and jump to that and move forward, and that's great. Only one group actually suggested in the pilot group, only one group actually wanted to confirm what that red box was. So that was an interesting bit as well. And that's not a detail that I decided to play with in the pilot scenarios and exercises that I did. And by the way, it wasn't ransomware at all. That can feel a little bit like a trap. What I like to do is to provide generic details or incomplete details, things that don't quite define what it is, but merely hint or suggest what it could be, and let the participants fill the rest with their own imagination. Because that allows the scenario to be really specific to their reality and how things work for them. If you get too prescriptive in the descriptions at the beginning, if it's not generic and really general and lightly described, then you force things, you end up having to backtrack and change details to make it relevant to the organization. If you start with a really undefined bit of detail, then the participants will fill in that detail for you and you know what to do next. If you remember from the participant experience video about flow, it's not the first thing you say that's important, it's the second. So you can, if you provide really amorphic, undefined details at the beginning, let the participants fill in those details for you, then you can respond to that with far more targeted and more detail and push that to the participants in a way that's relevant to them. Now, for some groups, I didn't go much further than that. For the next hour, we were talking about how ransomware would affect the organization, what we need to do, what resources they pull in. And it was at just that initial detail that we provided, that initial impact was more than enough. And that was challenging enough, and it required a lot of discussion and working through how the organization would respond. For most of the others, it required a little bit of extra steps. For instance, one of my planned injects was, and 5 other executives also start reporting there's a red box talking about encryption and Bitcoin. And so then what I want to do with that type of an inject is to know whether or not it changes things that it is more than one. If it's just one, a lot of organizations have a pretty set playbook and a set bit of responses where they just deal with that and it's done. They can handle it in 30 minutes. Most organizations, once it hits more than 1 or 5, they now consider it to be an outbreak and they start engaging a completely different process. You might not know that from the organization, so a simple jump up in volume as a volumetric basic inject to say now it's 5, how does that change the situation for you? It might radically change it for the organization. In some organizations, it might not. They might put in the same amount of resources, whether it's 1, 5, or 500, it doesn't matter to them. But you get to gauge that, you get to learn that as you go. And if they say, yeah, it's 5, we just do the same thing we did for the 1, they very quickly move on. You don't need to dwell on that at all. The next plan inject in the ransomware pilot was that servers started to become unresponsive as well. Now, I didn't explain why. Remember, I try to give details that don't really define or suggest a specific course of action, that I provide details that could be interpreted in different ways, and I let the participants do that interpretation. And I respond then to their interpretation. So naturally, most technical people, most system administrators will start thinking that the servers are also being encrypted and hit with ransomware. That's perfectly fine. That's what I was kind of hoping for, but it could not have been. It could have been something completely different, something parallel, something coincidental and not related to the scenario at all, depending upon how sneaky I wanted to be. But it allows that open-ended type of response and interpretation as to what to do next. The next planned inject I had for that was that a whole bunch of servers in the virtualized environment, the virtual servers, also became unresponsive. Now, at this point, for an operational tabletop exercise, that's more than enough. You're talking about several hours worth of work in terms of response. There's lots of different procedures to bring in. At an operational level, you're now making it a major incident. Now senior management needs to get involved. There's lots of stuff to get into. There's just a lot of details to dig into. And usually that's enough. And what I did in the pilots for those organizations where we actually progressed through a lot of the injects, we talked about the fact that this is an actual attack that another organization experienced. And that this is real, this is credible, this has happened before in a couple different organizations, and that organization would need to be prepared for something like that. And some of the organizations were really shocked to know that ransomware could be such a big issue and it could be a lot bigger than what they thought. In one organization, I actually brought in a lot of these very specific technical detail because the participants were highly technical and very experienced. And so I started talking about the details that the attacker didn't just infect, but the attacker gained access to accounts and controlled the devices, infected laptops, and used the laptops to look for other laptops and other servers, and eventually infected every machine in the network. And this is how they did it. And I only know that because I did the research on the historical attack, and I knew the details, the narrative, and the timeline, and I could just simply explain it all at the end. So this was really useful. From a tabletop exercise perspective, I really only provided at max 4, and with the one organization, I need to get a little bit deeper. So it was more like 5, 6, or 7 specific details and injects. But for most of everybody else, it was less than 4 injects that I provided in order to get them to a flow state, to get them to a point where they're examining their gaps, they're challenged, they know what they need to do, and they know what they need to improve. The injects are really helpful, but the magic here are your questions, how you dig into their responses and get them to confirm that their responses are what they need to be. The first example that I provide you was about tying your shoe, which is a really short and sweet little tabletop exercise. The ransomware, I could easily take these 4 injects and run that tabletop scenario. Depending upon the organization, I could run that for 3 or 4 hours if I wanted to. Please don't run a tabletop exercise more than 90 minutes. People's brains fry. But it's not about the amount of details you need in order to make the tabletop exercise successful. It's about how you respond. It's about asking those questions. And you don't necessarily need to be an expert in attacks or cybersecurity or incident response to be able to do that. It's all about asking curiosity questions, asking consequence questions, and digging in to what they're saying and get them to challenge themselves on their own responses. So being a facilitator can be a lot of fun. It can be really challenging because you yourself are challenging yourself and you are increasing your ability in order to meet those challenges, and you put yourself into a flow state in the middle of every tabletop scenario. And in so doing, you're also putting the participants in the flow state as well. Everybody learns, everybody gets better, everybody improves, and the world on a whole is better for it because all these organizations and all these people are getting better at incident response and protecting people, digital assets, and information, which is the point of the whole thing.